Well, Ty, welcome. I'm sitting here with Ty Sagalow. He's our Chief Insurance Officer at Premonition. Ty, what convinced you to join us at Premonition?
You know, I'm an old insurance guy, right? So I've been in insurance for 35 years, all but the last few in the traditional insurance arena, 25 at AIG. And throughout my entire time in insurance, I was involved in innovation, and I was a Chief Innovation Officer of a number of companies and President of AIG Product Development for AIG, and had many roles throughout the decades inventing new insurance products like Y2K insurance and the current form of D&O, with obviously an entire team of really terrific people. And I thought it was a lot of fun, and I thought we were doing a lot of cool things, and we kind of were. But when I got to be older, I realized that traditional insurance carriers can only really do incremental insurance. That true disruptive insurance and true disruptive innovation in insurance has to come from outside the industry. So I went on my own, sort of looking for the big disruptive insurance, and eventually was found by two entrepreneurs that wanted to create this insurtech company called Lemonade.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, so I was grateful enough to be asked to be employee number 3 of Lemonade, the chief insurance officer of Lemonade, and really put together the Lemonade insurance company and the Lemonade operating team, if you will, at least in terms of the insurance aspect of it. And it took 2 years to do that, but it was done successfully, and Lemonade was launched in September 2016 in New York. And now, after the close of 2017, its first full year of operation, it's operating in 8 states and licensed in 25, and did 100,000 policies in its first year, and over $10 million in premium, and insured over $15 billion in insured value. And it's been called the Uber of insurance. So that gave me a wake-up call of what is called insurtech. Essentially technology companies that are going into the insurance industry to do something truly disruptive. After my time at Lemonade, I was looking for the next big thing, the next Lemonade. And that's where I found Premonition. And Premonition shares many of the attributes of Lemonade. Premonition, like Lemonade, brings transparency. Premonition brings transparency to the choice of legal counsel, the choice of creating outside counsel, and more transparency to the underwriting process of liability insurance that had ever existed before. Premonition is a technology company that is using its technology to create value, unprecedented value in my humble opinion, to the insurance industry. So when you guys asked me to help you out and be your chief insurance officer, I found it to be a tremendous privilege.
Well, we're excited to have you.
Thank you very much.
Obviously, big data is having a massive impact on the insurance industry. But let's look at it at the level of the everyday user, the person that's in the trenches with claims. What value does Premonition bring to that person?
So, you know, your average claim examiner has a really tough job. His or her job is to maximize the benefit to both the insured as well as to the carrier by trying to find the best attorney for that particular case in that particular jurisdiction at a reasonable cost. The problem is that historically there hasn't been data to do that. You can negotiate, of course, rates, and you can drive down the loss adjustment expense. But the more important part, which was finding the right attorney that would win more often in a particular jurisdiction against a particular opposing attorney in front of a particular judge, prior to Premonition, that data and analysis was simply not available.
So how can you use Premonition to reduce loss ratios?
So reducing your loss ratio is the single highest benefit that you can give both the insured and the insurance carrier. Many claims examiners and claim departments concentrate on reducing the expense ratio or reducing the loss adjustment expense by negotiating down rates, and Premonition data can help that as well. But the really cool part is reducing the ultimate losses by picking the right attorney for a particular case. So for example, by using a case report, which is one of the many, many reports available through Premonition, you can determine win rates for various jurisdictions in front of various judges in various cases and choose the attorney that has the highest win rate. Or, as a practical matter, you might look at the top 5 or 10 attorneys that have good win rates compared to the other attorneys in the same jurisdiction, and then interview those attorneys for other issues that you might want to talk to them about. This results in a dramatic, we think 30% or more, reduction in your loss ratio.
You mentioned win rates, and we've had numerous discussions with this, and it always comes up invariably as we pioneer some very specific and bring data to performance statistics in law. What is a win?
So the heart of the Premonition algorithm is calculating the comparable win rate of various attorneys by accessing what is the largest database of litigation in the country. Over 87% of all cases are in the Premonition database, and almost 1 million cases a day are being added. So imagine this huge database of plaintiff's attorneys, defendant attorneys, judges, jurisdictions, subject matter of the case. And like any other database, you can mix and match the data points any way you want. But one of the ways of doing it is to determine what Premonition calls the win rate of a particular attorney against another particular attorney in front of a particular judge. And the way that we determine win rates is through a number of rules. One is obviously a dismissal is a win for the party that had the case dismissed, the defendant. A judgment is usually a win for the plaintiff's attorney. And settlements are determined as wins based upon the local rules. The key is the examination of attorneys working under the same rules. So if you have a set of attorneys working in the same jurisdiction, on the same playing field, the Premonition database is used as a very effective way of comparing the effectiveness, if you will, of those attorneys, and that we call a comparable win rate.
Is there any other way of measuring attorney performance outside of win rates, performance outcomes? Does Premonition look at duration, length of case? How does that impact decision-making and claims?
So that impacts expense ratios, right? So there's this fallacy that says that if you want the lowest loss adjustment expense, if you want the lowest outside counsel expense, well, then you choose firms that have the lowest rate or the lowest blended rate if you negotiate a blended rate. And so your average claims examiner spends a lot of time negotiating rates with various outside firms. But that, of course, assumes that every law firm will spend about the same number of hours on the same type of case in front of the same jurisdiction. That isn't true, except prior to Premonition, there was no database to show you what was the average number of hours a particular attorney spent on a particular case in a particular jurisdiction. Now, with the Premonition database, you can then look at not just what the rate the negotiated rate for a particular law firm or a particular attorney, but the number of hours that that attorney will spend at that rate compared to his or her peers. In reality, you might end up spending less defense dollars with a firm or with an attorney that has a higher rate but spends less hours on that exact same type of case in the exact same jurisdiction.
So overlaying time as well as outcome, we have an effective way to really drill down into expense ratios, performances, and what impact does that have in terms of panel counsel selection? So for instance, you might be tied to a particular panel of firms.
So panel counsel selection is a key component of any claims department. You want to have a panel that has an acceptable rate and also does a terrific job. The problem is that you can negotiate the rate, but how do you figure out whether they do a terrific job? And historically, you would interview a number of firms and they would all say the same thing. They would say they have X number of attorneys, they have Y number of partners, they're in Z number of jurisdictions. They might mention a great case that they were involved in 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but it wasn't mathematical. It was very similar to how scouts used to decide on which baseball players to hire. It seemed to be more of an art than a science. Well, for those of you that watched the movie Moneyball or read about Moneyball, you realize that the entire way of choosing baseball players dramatically changed from an art to a science by using formulas and mathematics to make determinations as to combinations of players. Who's a good third baseman when you have this second baseman, when you have this first baseman? So what Premonition does, and one of the reasons why I'm so excited about being involved in the company, is that it's been called the Moneyball of outside counsel selection, the Moneyball of putting together a panel counsel. By looking at the actual comparable win rates, you can determine who should be on your counsel for a particular case in a particular jurisdiction and how they compare to their peers operating on the same playing field. Then you combine that with a discussion of duration and rate, and you have a way of reducing your expense ratio, reducing your loss adjustment expense, and reducing your loss ratio. Fundamentally change the way in which panel counsel will be put together.
Let's look at overall trends within particular jurisdictions throughout the U.S. Are there ways to use the Premonition data to, you mentioned that 1 million cases are coming into the database every day. Are there ways to leverage that information to understand trends that might be worrisome to a claims department, getting out ahead of dangerous issues or something that might be...
Absolutely. So the question is, can Premonition be used for portfolio management? We already know that the Premonition database, compared to and combined with its proprietary algorithm, can make the job of a claims examiner easier on an individual case. We also know that Premonition can be used to have a more effective way of creating your baseball team, of creating your outside panel counsel. But your question is, can it also be used for better portfolio management in terms of litigation trends? The answer is obviously yes. So by having access to this, again, millions of cases and more than 1 million cases, new cases added every day, you're able to determine the types of cases that are increasing, whether in the professional liability area, the intellectual property area, general liability area, et cetera, and the jurisdictions in which there are adverse litigation trends. This makes understanding and forecasting your ultimate losses 1,000 times easier than it was before.
So let's take it to a more granular level. We've talked about counsel selection. We've also talked about trends that you might see in particular jurisdictions. In terms of litigation management, in what way would it impact claims managers to look at a case and see what the record is for an opposing counsel, and to see what their particular performance record might be for that case type in front of a particular judge? Would that impact decision-making process?
It would immediately impact decision-making. So as every claims examiner knows, the decision is to whether to go to trial or to settle. And then if you do go to trial, whether if you lose, to appeal. The decision of settlement versus trial is based upon the likelihood of winning and the potential severity, rather the likelihood of losing and the potential severity if you do lose. Never before has there been a database that was able to give the claims examiner the hit ratio between two attorneys in front of a particular judge in a particular jurisdiction. If you're lucky, then the attorney that you have hired has a very good hit ratio against his opponent in front of the judge designated in a particular jurisdiction. In that case, you're more likely to go to trial. On the other hand, if you're in the unfortunate position of having an attorney that happens to have a very bad hit ratio against the opposing attorney in the jurisdiction in front of the particular judge, you're going to be more likely to settle, or maybe bringing in a second attorney to help out.
From a product standpoint, we built the open case report, right? That's what we're launching these pilots around. So that, I think we should talk to that specifically.
So the open case report is a really good way for a claims department to determine whether the Premonition model, whether the Premonition database combined with its proprietary algorithm is useful. And the way that the open case report works is that a carrier will give Premonition a dozen, 2 dozen, 100 of its open cases. And then Premonition will look at those cases, looking at the attorney chosen by the carrier, the opposing attorney, the jurisdiction, the judge, and the type of case, and then mark those cases on danger zones: red, yellow, green. So green is everything looks okay, you might want to bring this all the way to trial. Red, of course, is the opposite. Things don't look good, your attorney has a bad hit ratio in this jurisdiction against the opposing attorney, you might want to settle more likely. And then obviously yellow being in the middle. The bottom line is that it gives an ability for a claims examiner, either on an individual case or a claims executive on a portfolio basis, to make a more of a database decision on what to do with that particular claim and in the settle versus trial scenario.
From the perspective of claims within jurisdictions, we know that there are some friendly jurisdictions, some unfriendly, speaking from the perspective of a defense. What would you say is their value in being able to put specific win rate data behind that?
So one of the really cool things about Premonition is that it allows a claims department and a claims executive to see the exceptions to the general rule. Any good claims examiner will tell you that certain jurisdictions in the United States tend to be more pro-plaintiff than others. But, and decisions are made on claims based upon those sort of general, those general rules. But what isn't made is when those rules don't apply. The Premonition database are able to give you the exceptions, to be able to say, yes, X jurisdiction, and I won't say the obvious jurisdictions because you'll annoy someone that's listening to this video, but yes, in X jurisdiction, this tends to be more plaintiff-oriented. But if you're in front of this judge with this type of case and you have this attorney, especially against this other opposing attorney, the general rule doesn't apply, go all the way and go to trial.
And so that holds also for judges on a specific level.
Exactly right, exactly right. And there are certain judges that are generally plaintiff-oriented, and there are judges, other judges that are generally defendant-oriented, and good local counsel will know that. But what good local counsel won't know is, again, the exceptions. That a particular judge tends to be plaintiff-oriented, except if you have this particular setup, this particular attorney against this other particular attorney, and for whatever reason he tends to go in the opposite direction, or she tends to go in the opposite direction. Again, we go back to the concept of the Moneyball theory of claims decision.
There was a story actually behind that in the data that we saw in Miami. There was a particular judge, and they were only giving judgments out to plaintiffs for auto cases 5% of the time. What we found interesting, and that's, in general, this judge is right on the average with their peers. It's very down the middle of the road judge. But for this case type, for whatever reason, very strict, and much more so than their peers. And what we found, interestingly enough, though, that there was one plaintiff attorney in that courtroom that was responsible for 70% of the judgments that have been handed out in that judge's courtroom for that case type. So again, finding the exceptions.
And that's really what it's about. In many ways, the beauty of premonition is the ability to see the outliers, to see the exceptions to the rule. Because good attorneys, especially good local attorneys, will know generally the landscape, right? But what they won't know is the exceptions, because nobody pays attention to the exceptions. And the other beautiful thing about premonition is that you don't have to know the reasons for the exceptions. You just have to know the exceptions exist. You don't have to know why this third baseman does a terrific job when this other one is on first base and this other one is on second base. You don't need to know why. You simply need to know it is in putting together your baseball team. What we've determined is, from the perspective of a claims examiner or a claims department, the Premonition database, which includes 87% of all cases filed in the United States, bigger than every other litigation database combined, together with a proprietary algorithm that determines win rates for attorneys against opposing attorneys in front of certain judges in certain jurisdictions, will reduce the loss ratio by giving the ability of claims examiners to choose attorneys with better comparable win rates than their peers operating in the same jurisdiction. Will also be able to decrease your expense ratio by looking at the duration that a particular attorney or a particular law firm spends on the same case in the same jurisdiction as compared to their peers, then use that duration together with a negotiated rate you'd be doing without premonition to come out with your real defense costs, your real loss adjustment expense. And therefore, by using the premonition database together with the proprietary algorithm, you will be able to reduce your loss ratio and your expense ratio in ways that never existed before.
It's a great summary.
Thank you.
Litigation data has been notoriously difficult either to access and also to analyze. So, in your opinion, with regards to underwriting, if you've got now access to millions and millions upon millions of cases, and they're normalized across jurisdictions, what impact does that have on an underwriter and their modeling?
So, I'm an old underwriter, right? I was the chief underwriting officer of a large AIG subsidiary, and I've been in underwriting really for my whole life. Prior to the Premonition database, the only way to underwrite a risk was to get an insurance application, look at the answers in the insurance application, look at various documents that might be available in the public domain, and make a determination as to the riskiness of litigation against your insured, if you're talking about liability insurance, whether professional liability, director's office liability, or general liability. That was about it. And you couldn't go beyond that because there was no database that actually showed the total liability against your particular applicant. If you were writing lawyer's professional liability, you would find out the number of claims against your applicant for legal malpractice. Same as if it was medical, for medical malpractice, general liability, the same thing. But you wouldn't know what else was going on. You wouldn't know, for example, if you were underwriting small business D&O, whether there was a criminal action against the director or CEO of the company, whether they were in a divorce, whether there was a credit litigation. This would not appear in any of your underwriting, and yet is important and relevant to the underwriting of any liability insured. So a litigation database showing whether you're insured, if it's an individual, or whether the main executives or managers of your insured, if it's an entity, is the subject of any type of litigation, can arm the liability underwriter with critical information in making the underwriting decisions that, frankly, prior to Premonition, they would not have any access to.
One of the things that Premonition can do is they can run a comprehensive company profile, litigation profile as it were, and see what types of cases that company has been involved in, whether they're winning or losing those cases, how long the cases are lasting, and so on. And then we could also benchmark that to industry peers. Is that helpful to an underwriter?
You know, it's very helpful because the amount of litigation that has to be disclosed legally is a very, very small percentage. First of all, if it really only applies if you're a publicly traded company, and then you only have to disclose it if it's material pursuant to the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934. So little litigation, no matter how frequent, is arguably not material. At least most of the directors and officers I know of publicly traded companies would say it is not. And of course, if you're a privately held company, there are no, in general, SEC similar requirements. So the ability of an underwriter to find out how often his or her applicant for insurance is being sued, and as importantly, how often they're suing others, is largely non-existent prior to the Premonition database. But now with Premonition, you could simply put in the name of your applicant and know with an 86, 87% probability what cases they're being sued and what cases they're suing and what types there are, whether they're suing all their competitors, and regardless of whether the applicant deems it to be material or whether the applicant has an obligation to even disclose that materiality if it's, for example, a privately held company.
What is the impact for, let's say, LPL?
So the Premonition database, together with the proprietary algorithm, is probably most useful in many ways to the LPL underwriter, right? So right now, if you're underwriting lawyer's professional liability, you have an application, and the application may ask whether you've actually had claims in the past, and it will probably ask about, in general, what are the areas of practice that you operate in. But what it won't ask is anything about what your win rate is. And we know that a lawyer that consistently loses more cases in a particular jurisdiction against his competitors playing in the same playing field will sooner or later get a claim for legal malpractice. The more you lose, the more likely it's going to be that a client is going to think that you lost because you're bad. That is not at all disclosed right now in lawyer's professional liability underwriting in the application or otherwise. In addition to that, there's insufficient disclosure as to how many cases you take out of your particular area of expertise. As any LPL underwriter will tell you, It is much more likely that a lawyer will be sued when he takes that occasional case outside of his subject matter expertise. Some of that information is available in the insurance application if you're lucky enough to get it, but not in enough detail. Using the Premonition database, the LPL underwriter will know exactly how often a particular applicant takes a case out of his particular expertise, and even what his win rate is when he does that. Vital information for the LPL underwriter, which is simply not available now without the Premonition database.
How about with regards to D&O?
So small company D&O can be a frustrating underwrite because you don't usually have as much information as you would really want to have about your applicant. Very different than publicly traded company D&O, in which there is SEC disclosures, there are registration statements, there are 10Ks and 10Qs. It also tends to be more in the public eye. There's more likely that you're going to find articles. But in the privately held space, really very, very, very little of that. And certainly, other than the occasional PPM, no SEC disclosure, certainly no 10Ks and 10Qs. So what is the poor D&O, small business D&O underwriter going to do? It's almost a guessing game. You get an application, you find out whether there would have been actual claims, that's really about it. You don't know anything really about the CEO and about sometimes the 1, 2, or 3 people that are running the company. You don't know whether they're going through a divorce. You don't know what their credit score is. You don't know if there's been any litigation against them. You don't know if they tend to litigate against others. You know nothing. So what's terrific about the Premonition database is that it can be connected automatically to your automated D&O underwriting system through API and be able to flag for your small business D&O underwriter those applicants that have red flags. And therefore that would then go to an individual or would go to a senior underwriter to look at it more deeply. This is vital, in my humble opinion, in small business D&O, and really other than the Premonition database, there's no other way that I'm aware of doing it.
How about with regards to E&O?
So underwriting small E&O policies is a frustrating experience. For the larger professional liability companies, some of them, first of all, are publicly traded. You can get a lot of information about it. And even the ones that aren't publicly traded have a lot of data. And there's usually dozens, sometimes hundreds of professionals. And so you have the law of large numbers. But in the small professional liability field, whether it's MPL, LPL, real estate E&O, accounting E&O, it really is based upon that individual or a set of very small individuals. And you don't have as much information as you would like. You'll get an insurance application, and if you're lucky, there'll be a warranty statement, and you may have some information about prior claims and areas of business and top 5 clients, but that's really about it. What you don't know is what else is happening to that single practitioner or the top 3 in the small firms in terms of litigation. You don't know if they're going through a divorce. You don't know if they're having litigation on their credit. You don't know if there's criminal proceedings against them. You know nothing about them as individuals, which is critical in the underwriting of small professional liability. And the reason why the small professional liability underwriter knows nothing is that prior to Premonition, that data was simply not available, but it is now.
Given that Premonition has the world's largest litigation database and is pulling in cases at a rate of upwards of 1 million per day, with that, it's able obviously to track new case volumes and trends with regards to filings. And it's also able to look at outcomes of those cases in the various jurisdictions. What sort of risks does that help the underwriter pick up or be aware of in their job?
So the ability to look at litigation trends is critical for portfolio management in terms of underwriting. And this is some of the frustration for the smaller insurance companies. If you are a top 5 insurance company, you have a huge amount of claims information. And although you don't have access to other carriers, unless you happen to be an ISO product, you still have a lot of information to go on. And the use of big data is king in insurance and has been for a little while. But what about the smaller insurance company? The small insurance company that doesn't really have enough data in its own database of claims to understand claim trends. That's where the Premonition database becomes very, very, very important. But with access to the Premonition database of representing over 87% of all civil litigation in the United States today, and adding up to 1 million cases or more a day to that database, gives the underwriting department on a portfolio basis, especially for small carriers that can't rely upon their own data, the ability to spot legal trends, exposure trends, and litigation trends that otherwise they simply wouldn't be able to do.
Premonition provides lots of different types of reports, and you can see the descriptions on the website, endlessly look at the different types of things that you can do with the data. But let's narrow it down a little bit. What are the most useful reports for an underwriter?
So you're right. I mean, Premonition has well over a dozen different reports. Again, you have a large database. It can be sliced and diced in just about every other way you can think of. But to simplify, when I think about it from the point of view of the underwriter, there are 2 reports that really come to my mind. The first is simply called the company report. So you use this if you have an applicant, so you ask for a report on that particular applicant, and then you will know how often that applicant is being sued, how often that applicant is suing others, where, in what subject matter, and beyond the particular type of liability that you're underwriting. And that's what's really cool part, right? So if you're underwriting LPL, it's not just how often your applicant has been sued for legal malpractice. One, you can probably get that in other places depending upon whether you're getting a warranty or not. But 2, whether they're being sued for other things, criminal, credit, divorce, anything that would affect your judgment as an underwriter. Also, who have they sued? So that's simply called the company report, although obviously if the insured is an individual, it's on that individual. The other report that comes to my mind is more of an underwriting portfolio report, and that's called the risk report or the risk trend report. And that will tell an underwriting department where are the legal litigation trends, what types of cases have increased in frequency, in what jurisdictions, which have decreased in frequency, and what are some of the new types of cases that are being brought in, perhaps jurisdictions that those cases were not brought, in the past.
With regards to claims departments, what types of reports are most useful and bring the most value to a claims department?
So Premonition has really dozens of reports. When you have a database that has 87% of all civil cases and you're adding up to 1 million cases or more a day, you're having a lot of data on a lot of different aspects of those cases, and that can be sliced and diced in just about every way that you can think of. But there are 3 reports that come to my mind when I think about a claims department. And the first report, and often this is how claims departments first see whether Premonition adds value to them, is a what we call an open case report. So that simply looks at all the open cases or a subset of all the open cases that a particular carrier will have, and then analyzes it on a sort of a medium level based upon the attorney that's chosen, the opposing attorney, the judge, and the jurisdiction, and marks that case in grades of hazard. So red, yellow, green. Green obviously means the combination looks good, go ahead, you go to the trial, hopefully things will go be well. Red is obviously opposite. Have a problem, you might want to get out of this right away, you might want to settle, etc., and of course yellow in between. But the open case report is often used with the second report. It's a case facts report. So you use the case facts reports by looking at all the red cases, maybe some of the yellow, to drill down exactly what is the aspect of that case that made it red or yellow. Is it the judge? Is it the opposing attorney? And then you can take a particular action step. For example, if you find out that the judge is okay, but the opposing attorney seems to be really good, for whatever reason, against the attorney you chose, well then, instead of settling, maybe have a second seater. Another attorney that's in that jurisdiction that has a better money ball hit ratio against a particular opposing attorney. And that's called a case facts report. Now, the third report that comes to my mind is the appeals report. Now, what that does is very, very cool. So, imagine you're a claims examiner and you've gone to trial and you either won or lost. And of course, whoever lost is now putting on appeal. Now you have a different issue in front of you. Do you continue with the appeal or do you settle on appeal? Now, part of that decision is, well, how good is the attorney that I have? Maybe he was great or she was great on the trial level, but how is she or he on the appellate level? Then you ask Premonition for the appeal report. That would give you a list of attorneys in the particular jurisdiction for that case in that appellate jurisdiction that have a higher hit ratio compared to their competitors. And you use that to determine whether to settle or whether to continue on your appeal. So for the claims examiner, I see the open case report, the case facts report, and the appellate report as probably the top three reports that would help them do his or her job.
There's a common misconception with some people that I've spoken with regards to Premonition, and that it is only applicable to your cases if they go to trial.
So it's a very common misperception about the Premonition database and the algorithms. First of all, the database covers 87% of all civil cases in the United States and cases also, by the way, I should say in the UK and other countries as well, and there are more and more being added every day. Just in the United States, over, I think, 1 million or more a day is being added. And those are all cases. So not just the ones that go to trial, not just the ones that have successfully gone to verdict. But the other misperception is how the algorithm works. The algorithm is not looking at only those cases that have gone to verdict or gone to trial and being dismissed. The algorithm looks at all cases, including cases that have been settled, and makes a determination of win rates using an algorithm in which it shows how attorneys have done compared to each other on the same level playing field in the same jurisdiction.
How is big data impacting insurance?
So I'm not giving away any secrets when I say that in the insurance field, data is king. And in general, the more data, the better. And so there's a whole phenomenon of big data. Where do you get the data? How much can you get? And what do you do with it? Now, this has dovetailed into a recent phenomenon the past 2015 or so called InsurTech. So InsurTech is the combination of the use of technology to help insurance companies and insurance brokers and the insurance industry do a better job. And doing a better job means adding more value to your customers and also more value to your shareholders by reducing expenses, by increasing efficiency, and hopefully also being more customer friendly. So whether you are a new InsurTech company or whether you're a traditional insurance company, you're looking at technology and you're looking at data to determine how you can increase your value proposition to your customers. Premonition is the latest company. So while Premonition has been around since 2014, it is a newcomer to the insurance field. Historically, it's been selling its access to its database and its proprietary algorithm on attorney win rates directly to law firms and to other entities outside the insurance industry. But recently, Premonition has realized that a prime target of companies that are interested in the Premonition database and Premonition proprietary algorithm would be the insurance industry. Why is that? Well, the Premonition database consists of 87% of all civil litigation in the United States, and up to 1 million cases or more are being added every day. In fact, its database is larger than all of its competitors combined. That is big data. And the database consists of the plaintiff's attorney, the defendant's attorney, the judge, the jurisdiction, the subject matter expertise, and of course, who won or who lost. Prior to Premonition, this size of database simply didn't exist. Now, if you add that database, compare and combine it with a proprietary algorithm, artificial intelligence, that determines comparable win rates between attorneys operating in the same jurisdiction on the same level playing field, now you have something really, really good for the insurance industry. Good for the underwriting part of the insurance industry and good for the claims part of the insurance industry.
So how is it good for underwriting and claims? Can you give us a general overview?
Sure. So let's first start with claims. So claims examiner has a hard job, right? The claims examiner has to determine what is the best way that a particular liability claim is handled. Which attorney should I use? What rate should I negotiate? What is the ability that I can handle this claim in a way that is best for my insured, as well as consistent with my obligations to my employer? This is hard stuff. Prior to the Premonition database, most of the time was spent in negotiating rates. You would want to create a panel counsel, you would negotiate the lowest volume discount you can get, and you really didn't have an ability to determine which law firms to hire, because everybody said the same thing. They all said, I had X number of lawyers, Y number of partners, I'm in Z number of jurisdictions, and I might talk about a case that I won 5-10 years ago. It was similar to how scouts determined who to hire as a baseball player. It was more of an art. Now, for those of you that remember or watched the movie Moneyball, you remember how all that changed. And that starting with Moneyball, the selection of baseball players was done by a scientific method, a formula that looked at combinations, third baseman, first baseman, second baseman, right fielder, etc. The combination that was most likely to win. Premonition takes that concept and applies it to litigation and the selection of outside counsel. So by creating an algorithm that determines win rates for various attorneys operating within the same level playing field, it allows the claims department to lower the loss ratio by picking the right attorneys, lower your expense ratio by now knowing the duration of the case per attorney. So understanding not simply the rate, but the rate times the likely number of hours unknown prior to Premonition, as well as other things that are described in the claims portion of the website. Now, in terms of underwriting, knowing whether your applicant has litigation against him, her, or it, or brings litigation against others, is critical to any sort of underwriting of liability insurance. But again, prior to Premonition, the poor liability underwriter only knew what was on the application. And if they were lucky, they might know about claims in the particular exposure. So a lawyer's professional, they might know how many legal malpractice claims if they got a warranty or if it was a main form app. But they wouldn't know anything else. They wouldn't know whether the individual is subject to criminal actions, the individual is in the middle of a divorce, the individual had credit litigation, or anything else that was important. So the Premonition database can allow the liability underwriter to know what litigation has been made against the applicant, as well as what litigation the applicant has made against the others. Now that's in general. Then you take specific fields like lawyer's professional liability, knowing the win rate of your applicant, really important to lawyer's professional liability, small business D&O, small E&O. Prior to the Premonition database, the poor underwriter only had what he had with the application. Now, thanks to the Premonition database and its proprietary algorithm, that underwriter is now armed with more information than it ever had before in order to make data-based underwriting decisions that simply was not possible prior.
So let's talk about expense and loss ratios. Can Premonition help and bring value to underwriters in that context?
The Premonition database combined with its proprietary algorithm can bring tremendous value in both loss ratios and expense ratios. But let's talk about loss ratios for a second. As every insurance carrier will tell you, its biggest dollars out the door is in losses. They account for 50 to 80%, sometimes more, of the premium. Now, there's a couple of approaches that have been used to reduce your loss ratio. The first approach is known as being a smarter underwriter, and carriers spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to be a better underwriter using big data and otherwise. How to figure out what the appropriate charge would be for the particular risk, and frankly, sometimes how to decline or completely avoid the really bad risks. The Premonition database can be helpful to that function by bringing to the underwriter information that was not otherwise available to him or her by looking at, for example, the amount of litigation against a particular insurance applicant in any arena, not just the exposure you're looking at, but other exposures that you would not get in the application that are relevant to the underwriting process. So we all agree that being a smart underwriter is a key to lowering your loss ratio, and Premonition can help do that. But the question becomes, what can a claims examiner do to lower a loss ratio? That's a more difficult exercise because historically claims examiners concentrated on the easier thing, which was to reduce the expense ratio, the loss adjustment expense of a particular claim by negotiating panel counsel rates. Panel counsel rates is the easier thing to do. What's harder is figuring out which lawyers to use that would decrease your loss ratio by increasing the lawyers that have the better win ratio against a particular attorney in front of a particular judge in front of a particular jurisdiction. i.e., if a claims department and a claims examiner would have a database that would help them make a determination as to which attorneys have better win ratios operating in the same jurisdiction, the same level playing field, a comparative nature, that could have a dramatic impact, meaning 30% or more, in the reduction of the loss ratio. And of course, if you had a database that also could tell you the average duration of a particular case, if you had attorney A versus B, you can use that duration analysis combined with the negotiated rate to get a lower overall defense cost. So I still believe that the loss ratio is the thing to concentrate on, and that's why I'm so excited about the Premonition database combined with the proprietary algorithm of win rates and the reduction of the loss ratio, both from the point of view of the underwriter as well as from the claims department. And as sort of icing on the cake, the ability to decrease defense costs and therefore decrease the expense ratio as far as that's concerned as well.
So is the Premonition database perfect?
You know, Nathan, I've been doing new product development in the area of insurance for decades. And I don't think I ever worked on a new product, a new insurance product that was perfect. There's an old saying, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And in my years at AIG, that was a cornerstone of us coming out with a new product. The key for any new insurance product, or any new product outside of insurance, is whether it puts the customer in a better position than they would before the product. In the case of Premonition, what this means is, can an underwriter underwrite better if they had access to the Premonition database and algorithm than they would prior? For a claims examiner, it means, can the claims executive get better results, a lower loss ratio, and a lower expense ratio by access to the Premonition database than they would prior? The answer to that is yes. Is everything perfect? Absolutely not. And we're continuing to improve it every year, and it will continue to be that way. Such is the case with every new product that I've ever worked on.
In regards to lawyer selection, Ty, I hear this all the time, we already know who the best people are.
Well, it reminds me of Moneyball, right? So prior to Moneyball, the scouts would say, we already know who the best baseball players are. I know, I can look at how the guy pitches, I can feel it, it's an art, it's not a science. I already know who the best third baseman is. I already know who the best pitcher is. And then all of a sudden, Moneyball blew out that theory. And this happens over and over again in the case of innovation. When art turns into science, where there are feelings, there are now formulas. And that's what's happening with outside counsel selection. That's what's happening as a result of the Premonition database and algorithm. Going from I have lunch with the guy, he's really good, he tells me stories about cases he won, to a scientific method of determining win rates. It's Moneyball all over again.
So it actually allows you to take in a more in-depth approach to each circumstance on its own merits. So using the analogy with Moneyball, applying it to law, it might be, when you're looking at baseball, it might be, yeah, that pitcher is a great pitcher, but he really isn't great against batters that are excellent with hitting high in the zone and they happen to bat right-handed, or switch hitters. It allows you to really look at various combinations to find the optimal pairings.
I think that's a great point, because Premonition is about combinations. It's not about absolutes. So like a baseball, a pitcher is in general a good pitcher, but not against a particular batter, maybe even a particular stadium. Same thing is true of outside counsel. You can have a lawyer who's generally pretty good, but in this jurisdiction against this opposing attorney in front of this judge, he doesn't do well. So as Moneyball has brought science to the combinations necessary of putting together a winning team, so Premonition does the same thing in terms of outside counsel selection.
So with regard to lawyer selection, how can Premonition be used to filter down the field of lawyers out there for a particular subject type or case type and find the top performers? So
the Premonition database does not have to be used to select the attorney that you want to add to your panel or the attorney that you want to have on this particular case. It can be used simply as a filtering process. So there are dozens or hundreds of attorneys in a particular jurisdiction. And what you want to do is not use your feelings or your gut or who you know or who you had lunch with, but use a database and formulas to drive down or filter the top 5 or 10 firms, or individual attorneys actually, not just firms, but individual attorneys that have high win rates in that particular jurisdiction. And then after filtering it down to the top 5 or 10 attorneys with the highest individual win rates, you can then use a second step that you've historically used, which is obviously meet the attorney. See whether you get along personally, ask some questions, obviously negotiate rates. So while some carriers may use the Premonition database to make the final decision. Many more just use it as a filtering process to get to the next level of analysis.
Well, Ty, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and have this conversation. It was very informative. Very much appreciate your insights.
Well, thank you, Nathan. I very much enjoyed it as well.